All right, so get ready, because we're about to explore the dark side of Worcester, Massachusetts. We're going deep into a real-life cold case with this one,
Ooh.
the Main South Woodsman.
Wow.
We'll be using information pieced together from Wikipedia for this deep dive. It's a story full of unsolved mysteries and set in a neighborhood known as much for its red light district as it is for all the chilling events that took place there.
Yeah, what I think is really unsettling about this case is how it shows that violence can happen in like normal everyday places.
Yeah.
We tend to think about danger as something that happens out there, but this Maine South Woodsman case is a lot closer to home.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
It's disturbing.
For sure.
Yeah.
So between 2002 and 2007, maybe even longer, this unidentified serial killer preyed on vulnerable women.
Right.
And to make things even more complex, there's a prime suspect, Alex Sesney, who seems to fit the profile but was never actually charged with these specific murders.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's important to start by talking about the victims. There were 5 women, all Hispanic, all with similar physical characteristics and
Right.
kind of in similar situations in their lives.
Right.
So first, there was Carmen Rudy, whose remains were found near Hillside High School in Marlborough in 2003. This was almost a year after she disappeared.
Wow.
And then there was Bitsaida Montalvo. They found her just a few meters away from Carmen.
Really?
Yeah, and figuring out who she was a huge challenge. Forensic scientists actually had to, rebuild her skull and create a digital image to identify her.
It's just so disturbing that they were found so close to a school,
Yeah.
like just a few dozen meters away.
Yeah.
That detail really gets to me. It makes you think about the killer's motives, like why there?
It does. And tragically, both Carmen and Bitsaida had children.
Right
It
on.
just highlights, how these crimes have such a ripple effect and the trauma that it inflicts on the families left behind.
Yeah, for sure.
And then there's Danelia Torres, who disappeared in the fall of 2003. They found her body in a wooded area near Hudson, which isn't too far from where they found Carmen and Bitsaida.
The location seems really important here.
Right.
It makes you think the killer knew the area pretty well. Like maybe it was a dumping ground he felt comfortable using. Like
Yeah.
he was trying to, I don't know, make these women disappear, dispose of them in a place where they wouldn't be found easily.
Yeah, that's a common thing in serial killer cases.
Mm.
Choosing a specific location, that control.
Right.
It often points to them wanting power, wanting to, control this situation.
Yeah, wanting to control the narrative, kind of.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, right. Now, Wendy Morella's case is a little different.
Right.
She disappeared in 2004 and was found in York, Maine.
Oh, wow.
But the strange thing is, unlike the other victims, they found her fully clothed and still wearing her jewelry. Makes you wonder if something went differently with her,
It does.
Eh.
That's actually one of the most confusing parts of this whole case. Did something happen to interrupt the killer's usual pattern? Was there a reason why he treated Wendy differently? Or could this mean there was another killer involved?
So many questions. And then there's Lenaida Oliveira,
Right.
a mother of 11 who vanished in 2007 right after giving birth to twins.
Yeah, her story is particularly sad. Her family said she was homeless and struggling with addiction.
Oh, wow.
But they also said something interesting. They said she usually left contact info if she was going out with someone she didn't know. The fact that she didn't do that this time makes you think that maybe she knew whoever killed her.
That's a scary thought.
It is.
And it's something we see a lot in these cases.
Yeah.
Some kind of connection between the victim and the killer.
Right.
So with all these disappearances and disturbing discoveries, the FBI got involved to help with the investigation.
Yeah, and the FBI brought in profilers to try and build a psychological profile of the killer.
Okay.
They thought he was probably a blue-collar worker, maybe someone who liked to fish or hunt.
So someone who'd be comfortable in the woods where they found the bodies.
Exactly. And they also thought he probably had a rough childhood, maybe a history of violence against women, and would have been between 28 and 41 years old at the time.
Wow. That's a super specific profile. Did it lead them anywhere?
It did. That's where Alex Sesney comes in. He fit the profile in a way that was, almost too perfect.
Wait, what do you mean by too perfect?
Well, let's look at the facts. He had a history of violence against women, including charges for assault and rape.
Right.
And he also might have had a connection to the area where they found some of the victims.
Oh,
His family owned a farm near Hillside High School in Marlborough.
that's a pretty disturbing coincidence.
It is, and it doesn't stop there. The kind of violence Sesney committed in the past is very similar to what the Main South Woodsman did.
Mm-hmm.
Back in 1996, he was arrested for beating a prostitute. raping and trying to strangle a woman, and also sexually assaulting a young girl.
Oh, wow.
It's like a scary reflection of the brutality we see in the Woodsman's crimes.
Yeah, all those details paint a pretty unsettling picture.
Yeah.
It's almost like we're seeing this escalation of violence, a progression toward more and more brutal acts.
That's a really good observation. It makes you wonder what he was doing in the years between those incidents and when the Main South Woodsman appeared. Was he quiet during that time? Or were there other crimes that just haven't been discovered yet?
That's a really scary thought. Did they ever connect him to any other crimes?
Yeah, they did. In 2002, Cesny was indicted for the rape of a girl in Horwich. He tried to strangle her with a necktie,
Oh my God.
but sadly, they had to drop the charges when the victim died.
So her testimony was the only evidence?
It was.
That's awful. It makes you wonder how many other potential victims are out there who never got to see their attacker brought to justice.
That's a sad truth in these kinds of cases. Often there are more victims than we know about, and their stories might stay hidden unless new evidence comes up or the perpetrator confesses.
And speaking of confessions, didn't Cesny confess to another murder?
He did. In 2008, they charged Cesny with the murder of Teresa K. Stone.
Oh, okay.
She was a prostitute who was beaten and strangled back in 1996. And the way she was killed is really similar to how the Main South Woodsman operated.
Right, so we're seeing this pattern of violence against women, especially prostitutes, and a lot of these cases involve strangulation.
Yeah.
It's all very disturbing. But if he did all this, why didn't they charge him with the Main South Woodsman murders?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? Even though he was a prime suspect, Cesny always said he had nothing to do with the Woodsman case, and he refused to talk to investigators.
So because they didn't have enough solid evidence and he wouldn't talk, this case is just kind of stuck.
Exactly.
It-
It's a frustrating situation for everyone, especially for the families of the victims.
Yeah.
They deserve answers.
Yeah, I can't imagine what they're going through knowing that the person who might have killed their loved ones is in prison, but he hasn't been held accountable for those specific crimes.
It's a tough situation. There's a lot of legal and ethical stuff to consider. And it makes you think, what if Cesny confessed to the Woodsman murders? What would that do to his conviction for Teresa Stone's murder?
Right.
Would it make the case against him stronger, or could it actually create problems?
That's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
It's like we're at a crossroads and one path might lead to closure, but the other could lead to even more uncertainty.
That's what makes this case so interesting. It's not just about who committed the crimes, but also about how we handle all the complications in the justice system and how we search for the truth.
We've covered a lot so far.
Yeah, we have.
We talked about the victims, the investigation, and how this prime suspect came into the picture. But what really gets me is that even though they had a profile and some evidence pointing to him, they never charged Cesny with the Woodsman murders.
It's like a puzzle that has all the pieces, but it doesn't quite fit together.
Right.
And the fact that Cesny won't talk, either to confess or clear his name, makes it even more mysterious.
Yeah, it's like he's challenging us to solve the puzzle ourselves,
I know, right?
to find the missing pieces that would prove whether he's guilty or not.
His silence really says a lot.
Yeah, it
Guys,
is.
it adds another layer of complexity to this already very complex case.
Well, listener, that wraps up part 1 of our deep dive into the Main South Woodsman case. It's a story that has definitely left us with more questions than answers, a whole web of intrigue and things we just don't know.
We've gone into the darkness, but there's still so much more to discover. Come back for part 2, where we'll dig deeper into what kind of person would commit these crimes, how it affected the community, and how the search for answers is still going on.
We'll see you then.
As we kind of keep going deeper with this Main South Woodsman case, the psychological profile of this killer, it just gets more and more interesting. It's like we're trying to understand the mind of a ghost, you know?
I see what you mean.
We have all these little pieces, these traits, but we don't know for sure who he was.
Right.
So it's really hard to get the whole picture.
It's like trying to put together one of those jigsaw puzzles, but like half the pieces are missing.
Yeah, exactly.
We know these awful things happen, and we see these glimpses into the lives of the victims, but the killer's reasons, there's still a complete mystery. And I think that's what makes these cases so fascinating, but also so disturbing.
Absolutely. We have to look at the worst parts of human nature and ask ourselves, what makes someone do these things? Is it where they grew up? Is it mental illness? Or is it like some really complicated mix of things? And honestly, how much can we really understand if we don't hear it from the killer himself?
Alex Cesny's past definitely brings up a lot of questions. It's clear that from a young age, He was violent towards women. It's like this deep-seated aggression, and he just didn't care about the pain he was causing his victims.
Yeah, and it's especially disturbing when you look at the details of those earlier crimes, the beatings, the times he tried to strangle women.
Right?
Those actions are really similar to the brutality we see in the Main South Woodsman's crimes.
It's hard not to see the connection. Do you think it's possible there are other crimes out there, ones we don't know about, that fit this pattern?
That's definitely something investigators must have thought about. With these types of criminals, things often escalate. They get more confident, more willing to take big risks.
Which makes me wonder, were there times they could have stopped Cessny before things got worse? Could they have done something to prevent these tragedies?
That's a really tough question. It's easy to see things more clearly looking back, with hindsight.
Right.
But maybe by looking at these cases closely, we can learn something and do better in future investigations. Every case, every victim deserves our full attention and a really thorough investigation.
That's a good point. And the good news is that new technology like DNA analysis and all the advances in forensic science are giving us new ways to look at old cases, even ones from decades ago.
Oh, for sure. Technology is super powerful. But you have to think about the people affected by these crimes, the
Yeah.
families of the victims.
Right.
They're still searching for answers, living with this pain and uncertainty because they don't know exactly what happened or why.
It's like they're carrying this burden, this heavy weight.
It is.
And it's not just the families, it's whole communities that are affected.
No.
There's this fear, this distrust, this feeling of being vulnerable.
Right.
And it just lingers.
Yeah, it casts a shadow over everything, a reminder of the darkness that touched those places.
It must be hard for law enforcement, too.
It is.
They put so much into solving these cases and bringing justice, and when a case stays open, it's got to feel like an unfinished puzzle.
Yeah, super frustrating.
Right.
But they're not alone in this fight.
Right.
There are groups dedicated to solving cold cases, researchers who are like experts in profiling,
Oh, wow.
and communities who refuse to let these crimes be forgotten.
That's really inspiring, actually. It speaks to how resilient people can be, The need for answers, the refusal to let these victims just fade away.
It does.
And sometimes it's the tiniest detail, something that seems insignificant. That can be the key to solving the whole thing.
Exactly.
And that's something important for our listeners to remember. If you know anything at all about the Main South Woodsman case,
Yeah.
please contact the authorities, even if you think it doesn't matter.
Even if it seems small or unimportant.
You just never know. It could be that missing piece.
Right. Sometimes it's like a little memory, something you overheard, or even just bumping into someone.
Yeah.
Those things could be super important. Never underestimate what you've seen or heard.
So let's talk about Alex Cessny's situation with the law. They convicted him for the murder of Teresa K. Stone, but he was never charged with any of the Main South Woodsman killing.
Right. And it's really important to remember that difference.
Okay.
He's still a main suspect in the Woodsman case, but he hasn't been found guilty of those particular crimes.
But being convicted for Teresa's murder, it's like this huge shadow hanging over everything.
It is.
The similarities are just too obvious to ignore.
Yeah. The types of victims, the way they were killed, even where they found the bodies. It's like two sides of the same coin.
I see what you mean.
One side is clear because of the conviction, but the other side is still a mystery.
Yeah, it creates this weird situation, legally and ethically.
It does.
Cessny did something horrible, we know that, but then we see this pattern that lines up with the unsolved murders.
Right. It's a tricky balance.
Yeah.
You got to respect how the law works.
Right.
But we also can't ignore the circumstantial evidence.
Yeah, it makes you think, what if he confessed to the Woodsman murders? What would that mean for his current conviction?
Yeah, would a confession be enough to overturn it? Or would it just make the case against him even stronger? It's a really interesting question.
It is. It gets to the core of how we look at evidence, confessions, and what it takes to prove someone's guilt.
This case really shows how complicated all those things are, how they all connect.
It reminds us that finding justice isn't always straightforward.
No, it isn't.
There are twists and turns, dead ends.
For sure.
And even when you think you've reached the end, more questions pop up.
Absolutely. These cases make us question what we think we know, and they force us to face some hard truths. And sometimes it's hard to tell who's guilty and who's innocent.
And in the Main South Woodsman case, that line is definitely still blurry.
It is.
We're stuck in this place where we can't really judge, always looking for that one piece of evidence, that missing link that will finally show us the truth.
It makes you wonder if there's something else out there, something investigators haven't found yet. Maybe someone knows something but hasn't said anything.
That's a creepy thought. But it shows how important it is to keep these cases alive.
It does.
We can't let them be forgotten. We have to keep asking questions, keep searching, and keep the pressure on for answers.
You're absolutely right. Even when it seems impossible, we can't give up on the truth and justice. And that's why these deep dives are so important. They keep these cold cases in the spotlight, they remind us about the victims, and they encourage anyone who knows anything to come forward.
So, speaking of all those unanswered questions, let's talk about some of the other theories people have about the Main South Woodsman. Since Cesny was never charged, and we still don't have any definite answers,
Right.
it makes sense that people would come up with their own ideas.
Yeah.
One of the most interesting theories is that there might have been a copycat killer, someone who saw what the woodsman was doing and wanted to do the same thing.
Yeah, that's a pretty intriguing theory.
So maybe they were drawn to all the attention the case was getting, all the media coverage, the fear it was causing.
Exactly. Copycat killers often want that same kind of recognition and power that they see in the original criminal. It's a scary thought that these horrific acts could inspire other people to do the same awful things.
It definitely makes things a lot more complicated.
It does.
Instead of trying to profile one killer, now you might be looking at multiple people
Right.
with different motives and backgrounds.
Yeah, it makes the investigator's job way harder. They have to go through all the evidence from the original crimes, but then they also have to think about anything that might be copycat activity.
It's like trying to untie a knot that just keeps getting tighter and tighter.
That's a perfect way to put it. And then there's the theory that throws the whole idea of a single killer out the window.
Right.
Maybe the Main South Woodsman wasn't just one person, but a whole group of people working together.
A serial killer team.
Yeah, but
That's almost too scary to think about. Is that something you see often?
it's not as rare as you might think. There are actually quite a few cases where couples or even small groups have worked together to commit murders.
But wouldn't having more people involved make it harder to keep things a secret? Wouldn't they be more likely to get caught?
Not necessarily. Think about it.
Hmm.
If you have a group that's well organized,
Okay.
where everyone is loyal to each other and they all have the same goal,
Right.
they could actually be really good at covering their tracks.
It's scary, but I guess it makes sense. The more people involved, the harder it is to figure out the truth. And in a case like the Main South Woodsman, where we have so many unanswered questions,
Yeah,
it's natural for people to come up with different theories.
absolutely. When there's no closure, people start to speculate. They want answers. They want explanations.
Right.
And if they don't have those, they come up with their own interpretations.
That's true.
That's part of what makes this case so fascinating, even after all these years.
It's like a puzzle with missing pieces, a riddle that keeps challenging us. And even though we might never know for sure who the Main South Woodsman was or why he did what he did, we can't stop looking for answers.
You got it. We can't let these cases just fade away. New technology, new ways of investigating, even just time passing, can lead to new clues.
Yeah, sometimes it's a little detail that someone remembers years later, or a piece of evidence that suddenly makes sense because of some new scientific discovery.
Right.
We can't give up hope.
We can't. There's always a chance of a breakthrough. A new witness could come forward, a piece of evidence could turn up, someone could look at the case in a new way and see something no one else saw.
That's what keeps the families of the victims going.
It does.
That hope that one day they'll finally get the answers they need, that justice will be served, even if it takes a long time.
It reminds us that even in the darkest times, even when things seem impossible, we have to keep searching for the truth.
Well, listener, that's the end of part 2 of our deep dive into the Main South Woodsman case. It's a story that still has more questions than answers, a maze of possibilities, and a desire for justice that hasn't been fulfilled.
We've gone deep into the darkness, looking at all the scary details and the possibilities that are hard to stomach.
Yeah.
But we've also seen how strong people can be,
Yes.
how investigators and communities never give up on finding the truth.
In part 3, we'll go even further into the theories about this case. We'll look at the complicated psychology of the killer and how the search for answers is still going on. Okay, so welcome back to our deep dive into the Main South Woodsman case. We've been exploring the dark side of Worcester, Massachusetts, where unsolved murders and this mysterious prime suspect have left us with way more questions than answers.
Right. We've really gone through all the details, the lives that were lost, and the investigation that led to Alex Cesny,
Right.
a man who fit the profile but was never actually charged with the Woodsman's crimes.
Right, exactly. And as we go into this last part of our deep dive, it kind of feels like we're standing at the edge of a dark forest, just peering into the shadows, hoping to see some sign of the truth.
I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Because there's no real resolution, no closure to this case, there's been so much room for people to speculate.
Right.
It's almost like the silence itself is creating all these new theories, new explanations to try to fill in the gaps where we just don't have answers.
Right. We talked about some of those theories before, but let's go a little deeper into the idea of a copycat killer.
Okay.
It's a scary thought that the things the Woodsman did could have inspired someone else to commit similar crimes.
It is scary, and it's something we've seen in other cases that get a lot of attention.
Yeah.
You know, the notoriety, all the media coverage, that fear that spreads through the community, those things can actually inspire some people.
Yeah.
You know, people who want that same kind of infamy.
So it's like the original killer's actions create this blueprint, this terrible legacy that someone else could pick up and continue.
Exactly. And that makes things much harder for investigators.
Right.
They have to go through the evidence from the original crimes,
Right.
but then they also have to consider that there might be copycat activity going on, which just makes everything way more confusing.
It's like trying to solve two puzzles at the same time with the pieces all mixed up.
That's a great way to put it.
Hmm.
And then, of course, there's the theory that completely changes how we think about who the killer might be.
Right, right.
The idea that maybe the Main South Woodsman wasn't one person, but a whole group of people working together.
We touched on that in the last part, the idea of a serial killer team.
We did.
It's something that I find both fascinating and absolutely terrifying. Like, how could a group of people be so coordinated and have that much trust to pull something like this off? It's mind-boggling.
It's a chilling thought, but it has happened before. There are plenty of cases where couples or even small groups have teamed up to kill, and sometimes they're so efficient and secretive that it's almost impressive in a really twisted way.
It makes you think, what kind of relationships would these people have? What would their motivations be?
Those are some of the things that forensic psychologists and criminologists are trying to understand.
Right.
You know, how groups work together, especially when it comes to criminal behavior. That's a really complex and often disturbing area of study.
So here we are with all these theories and unanswered questions. What do we do with all this information? How do we move forward in a case that feels like it's stuck in time?
Well, we have to keep looking, keep asking questions, and never let the fact that time has passed make us think the truth is less important. New technologies are always being developed, investigative techniques are always getting better, and sometimes even the smallest detail, something someone remembers years later, can be the key to cracking the case.
That's something I really hope our listeners remember.
Yeah.
If you have any information about this case, no matter how small or insignificant you think it might be, please contact the authorities.
That's right. Every tip, every lead is worth looking into. And with how much DNA technology and forensic science have advanced,
Right.
even cases that have been cold for years can be solved.
And that possibility, that sliver of hope,
Yes,
is what keeps the families of the victims going.
it does.
The hope that someday they'll finally get the answers they need and that justice will be served, even if it takes a while.
It reminds us that even in the darkest times, even when it seems like nothing will ever make sense, we have to keep searching for the truth.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into the Main South Woodsman case, we're left feeling uneasy, but also determined. Uneasy because of how brutal these crimes were and because we still don't have all the answers.
Right.
But also determined to never forget the victims, to keep their stories alive, and to keep pushing for answers.
This case really shows how complicated people are,
Yeah.
how fragile life is, and how hard it can be to find justice.
Yeah, it does.
It makes us face the dark side of our world,
Right.
the things that can happen even in places that seem normal and safe.
It's a powerful reminder that the search for truth never really ends.
It doesn't.
It takes constant effort, a refusal to give up, and the willingness to work together to find answers.
To all our listeners out there, we want to leave you with this. Stay aware, stay curious, and stay involved. There are mysteries all around us, and sometimes it's up to us to help solve them.
Thank you for joining us on this journey into a cold case that still haunts the city of Worcester. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.